Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. And this time it's a very special episode because we're talking about something that is very dear to us in the university world. And interestingly, also to newsreaders currently, because the word is on the street that in the United States, scientific freedom is under assault. The headlines and numbers are worrisome. Amidst federal funding cuts, even the wealthiest research institutions, such as Columbia University, have been forced to cut PhD positions and research projects, putting careers and scientific progress in jeopardy. Researchers abroad are likewise affected, also in Switzerland, if and when they collaborate with US colleagues in federally funded projects. But what is the significance of these federal funds for public and private institutions in the first place? Why have some colleges opted out of federal funding? And what is the aim of the Trump administration's apparent attack against science? Is it simply backlash against what it is considered a woke research agenda? Or is there something more sinister afoot? To better understand what is going on, I'm really happy to be joined by two professors who are seeing this firsthand and not just across the Atlantic, Michelle Lemons and Lee Trepanier, both at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Welcome, Michelle and Lee, for the first time on the podcast Grüezi Amerika.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us. Could you briefly explain what kind of university is Assumption University?
Oh, Assumption University is a private institution. It's a Roman Catholic institution. It's essentially a small liberal arts university of a little less than 2,000 students. It does offer some pre-professional programs in business and nursing, but its primary aim is liberal arts education.
Liberal arts education, so that is essentially your field as well. Lee Trepanier, you are, since less than a year now, the Dean of the Damour College of Liberal Arts at Assumption University, but you've been really around the country, I would say. I have rarely met anyone who has been to so many different institutions in so many different parts of the country. You were previously chair and professor of political science at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. Before that, you served in the same roles at Saginaw Valley State University in Michigan. You did your degree work at Marquette first in Wisconsin. Everyone who follows presidential elections often hears about Marquette because of one of its important polls. And you got your graduate training from Louisiana State University. So you have really seen very different types of institutions. Which one was the biggest of these that I listed here?
Well, the biggest is probably Saginaw Valley State University, which was a public regional comprehensive institution. At that time, when I was there, we had about 10,000 students. The student demographic was interesting because it was mostly first-generation college students, which it drew from sort of the rural white areas and sort of the inner city African-American students. And then you had, because you were in Michigan, you had a large contingent of Arab students. So navigating sort of the students' demographics was interesting. But that was sort of the biggest institution I was at. After that, I went to Samford University, which is a private Christian university that really, the student demographic was essentially upper middle class white students that were very wealthy, or came from wealthy families, which created a sort of own sense of opportunities and unique set of problems as well. And then other than Assumption, the other place my first position was at Southern Utah University, which was a smaller public comprehensive institution, but that student population was primarily LDS or Mormon.
So LDS for Swiss and German listeners is the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. So the abbreviation is LDS. We colloquially, I think, call them Mormons. I think they refer to themselves also as Mormons, but LDS seems to be the more proper name. Is that right?
Yes.
And Utah is kind of a regional overlap in both of your career biographies. So, Michelle, you hail from beautiful Virginia, where you did your bachelor's at the really beautiful William and Mary College. It's very beautiful. It's like the ideal, typical, I think, liberal arts college. And you then went on to get a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Florida. But you've also moved around for your career. So you were at the University of Utah, in Utah, of course, and to Hamilton College in the state of New York. And now you are a professor of biology at Assumption University, as well as a visiting associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. They're both in Worcester. A lot of our listeners will never have heard of Worcester, but this is really a university town. How different is it working at a place like Assumption University compared to the University of Massachusetts Medical School? Michelle, how different is the spirit, the atmosphere, the kind of work you can actually do?
Oh, yeah, those are two very different types of institutions. My primary appointment is here at Assumption University, where my job includes teaching. I teach a lot of undergraduate students and also commit a lot to service and to the community at large. And when I teach my students, I teach them sometimes in the classroom. Sometimes I'm teaching them in a lab that's associated with a classroom. And sometimes I'm teaching them in my research space. We're conducting novel research together. Then I do have collaborations and, as you mentioned, another appointment at our neighbor, the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School. And there I have collaborations that are supported by funding from the U.S. federal government. And there I have this amazing opportunity to bring our Assumption students over to the UMass Chan Medical School, a top-notch research school. And we get to work side by side amongst these amazing researchers whose job is fully research, and they train graduate students there. So my undergrads get to benefit from working in that environment where we have top-notch facilities, equipment, people, infrastructure, and it's really amazing. So my job at UMass Chan is research, and I get to fold in Assumption students into that environment where we work together as a team.
What would you estimate? How many of your students, what percentage of your students move on to get a master's degree after their undergraduate work?
Yeah, I don't have a firm number, but I would say every student that I can think of that comes to mind has gone on to either obtain a PhD. That's what many of my students do. Many of them go on to medical school. A lot of them have gone on to become other science helping professions, such as physician assistant, optometry, veterinary. So a lot of science programs have been pursued by my students. And that is, I think, in part because of this research experience that we can offer them here at Assumption and at UMass Chan, because it really helps elevate their understanding of science, and it also helps elevate their application. It looks rich and more promising when they have these experiences as an undergraduate.
So there's really a tight net web of research, science, and teaching in Worcester, Massachusetts. Now, we hear really bad news from the United States at the moment. Depending on what kind of newspapers you read, what media you consume, we get the picture of a country that is not only divided, that's something we've gotten used to through the years to hear that narrative, but now it gets more sinister. And particularly in our world, academia, people are accusing the new administration of essentially attacking academic freedom, and that science as such is under assault. So my first question on this subject: how is the mood in American academia right now? Is it as bad as we are told?
Well, I would say it's probably one of uncertainty. For administrators and for faculty and staff, is that there's uncertainty in terms of not only federal funding, but also in terms of, for example, the student application form for financial aid, known as FAFSA here. There's uncertainty how that's going to be processed, uncertainty about federal funding, uncertainty about what are the rules and regulations that the federal government is going to impose upon universities. So it makes it very difficult, just on quite frankly, on an operational level, to do any sort of planning and execution on programs. So I would say that's probably nationwide, regardless of one's ideology. It's just when you don't know what's going to happen, it's impossible to plan for it, and so it takes up a lot of time and effort that you weren't anticipating.
So you have to hedge for the kind of developments that you don't really foresee where they are going.
Exactly. I mean, so you have to sort of game plan it out, 4 or 5 different options depending on what happens. But I'd be curious on what's sort of the faculty mood, Michelle, do you think, in terms of with the new administration?
Yeah, as a scientist who's often had funding from the federal government and talking with other colleagues who have that same support, I would say it's extremely chaotic right now, uncertain for sure, but maybe taking that up a notch because, as for example, the UMass Chan Medical School, our neighbor here, because of these uncertainties and not only uncertainties, but a taking down of the process by which science is conducted here in the United States, by tearing that down and slowing it down. This has led to them to actually resend the graduate class that should have started this coming fall. So they go through this very extensive process of bringing in students, and it's really unfortunate because of this uncertainty that Lee was just mentioning. They've had to resend those offers, which is unprecedented, and they've also had a hiring freeze. And this is huge for me because I'm mentoring my students, right, who want to pursue graduate school, who want to go into the health professions. And they're asking me, what do I do? And I don't have a good answer, quite frankly, because their goal, their aspirations are looking quite grim at the moment, right? How can they get into school if schools are not accepting students or if they're rescinding offers? So we are, scientists, I would say, are very, very concerned about the future for science in this country, because if you can't train the next generation of scientists, that's huge. That's a significant drawback.
I'll just provide also maybe a concrete example that may illustrate this at the ground level. So about a month ago, the Trump administration issued the Dear Colleague letter, which essentially asked universities to review their any programs or primarily admission policy regarding sort of race-based preference to make sure we're in compliance with Supreme Court rulings. This was given the task to me from legal counsel. I sent an email out to my chairs saying, just here's the situation. Can you just provide me any information that you have on this? And I was not expecting much, but I do want to do my due diligence to make sure that we were in compliance. And the reaction from a few departments was pretty wrought, and I think they're pretty upset by asking the information, so we were in compliance. Though they understood that even though their program had nothing to do with sort of race-based preference programming, they felt a little angry or upset about that.
Yeah.
So I think what you have with some faculty is that they're even if this is a compliance issue, it can be sort of blown out of proportion or misinterpreted and sort of latched onto the greater political context as well.
So for us to better understand, Michelle, you mentioned that offers for graduate training have been rescinded and that you are now as a school also asked to comply with the Supreme Court ruling, meaning that you can't give affirmative action, that you have to have race-blind admission. But why can federal government have such influence also on private institutions? Because Assumption University is a private Catholic university. We're also looking at these extremely wealthy universities of the Ivy League, such as Columbia University and Harvard University. How can federal funding have such a huge influence on whether they can accept PhD students, on whether they can perform certain programs, whether they can conduct certain research projects? Can you give us better understanding of why federal government can have such an influence on private institutions of higher education?
I think actually Lee can speak better to this, but we have to, as a private institution, be compliant so that our students can access things like Pell Grants and federal support to allow them to help pay for the college tuition. But I want to turn that over to Lee because he would know more.
Most students who enroll in university here in the United States accept federal financial aid. And so for those students to be eligible for federal financial aid, the university, even private universities, have to be compliant with federal regulations. I think there's only 2 universities in the country that don't accept federal financial aid: Hillsdale in Michigan and Grove City in Pennsylvania. And so they can ignore federal regulation, but every other school, all the other schools in the country do. And that's the way the federal government's able to exert influence on all universities, whether public or private. It's probably worth mentioning to your listeners as well that a lot of attention has been given to the federal grants for universities, but actually most of the federal funding in higher education is for student aid. It ranges somewhere between 65 to 68% of student aid. Federal funding for higher education is for student aid. And federal grants is only about 27, 28% in that way. So you're still talking for federal grants about $50 billion a year. So it's a lot of money. But if you compare that to the trillions of dollars that are given to student financial aid, it's actually federal grants are much smaller. But really through federal grants and through student financial aid, and then to a lesser extent through partnership and contracts, is how the federal government is able to have some say or control over both public and private universities.
So federal grants, that would be research funding for projects, etc. And student aid are, for instance, the Pell Grants that are granted on a needs basis. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So in the cases of Harvard or Columbia, we are looking at a mixture of both the problem that certain students won't receive aid when they are admitted to Harvard or Columbia. And so, well, they can't study if they can't foot the bill. And at the same time, we have the problem of federal grants being withdrawn or being in limbo, in a sense. Why is it that the government can actually decide on not giving you the grant money that you were assured to have in the first place? I mean, this is essentially a breach of contract from the government's side.
Well, exactly right. It creates. I mean, and that's why some of these cases are in the court system right now, and they're working their way through the courts, because it seems to be, if you have a contract or awarded a grant or a contract from the federal government for a university, that seems to be a breach of contract. Now, not going too much deep into the weeds of constitutional theory, is that the Trump administration is arguing a unitary executive theory, which essentially argues that the president has the right to use the money that's been given to him by Congress any way he or she sees fit. That's a very a theory that's not accepted by many legal scholars, but that's what they're basing their decisions on, and so that will make its way through the court system as well.
So, Michelle, you have several times been a principal investigator on National Science Foundation grants. Give us some idea of how do you get such a grant in the first place? So how competitive is it? How much money do we talk about? How much money can you actually get out of it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So these grants, and so you're right, I've had grants from the National Science Foundation, or the NSF. That's the second largest federally funded organization for science research. The largest one is the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. And I've also had funding in the past from the NIH. And both of these organizations support science research of three different flavors: basic research, translational research, and clinical research. I fall on the side of basic research. And all of these grants I can't express how competitive these grants are and how incredibly difficult it is to get these grants. They are constantly turning down excellent grant applications because of the sheer high quality and the number of grants that they get. So for some organizations, some institutes, we call them, the funding rate is like 8%. Like you have to be in the top 8%.
Oh, wow.
Of many, many grants that are excellent. Like these are other top-notch scientists submitting. So to finally be awarded a grant is such a huge feat. And should be celebrated, in my opinion. And I'm fortunate that I've had some, but I'm also fortunate that I'm in a position where because my primary focus is teaching, my job is not reliant on those fundings. But that's not the case for many larger institutions, research institutions that are also teaching, but are more reliant on these funds to do this research and to support the students. So therein lies a lot of the freezing hires that are happening, the layoffs that are happening. It's because of this uncertainty to be able to fund and move forward and to be a functional institution.
So if I understand this correctly, then a lot of institutions who do, for instance, clinical research have started to rely on a certain level of success with these federal grants so that they plan their staff accordingly.
Yeah, so many of these, that kind of goes back to the question that I didn't fully answer earlier. These grants, there's many different flavors of grants, and they have different durations. Some are short as 1 or 2 years, and some are longer, 5 years or even longer. So when let's say you have a 5-year grant, you get that grant, and then in the past, you could always count on receiving that grant for 5 years. That was never in question. Although I will say what has been in question in the past is, you ask for a certain amount with this grant, and you justify this through a very thorough budget analysis. And oftentimes you were awarded the grant, but not as much money as you had asked. They usually give you less than what you ask. And even then...
we know that in Switzerland too.
Yes.
I think that's very common.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry for that. Right, you have to do more with less. And the other thing with the NIH and NIH in particular is they've been flat for many, many years. By this, I mean the budget has not grown, but yet expenses have grown and salaries have grown. And so even if the budget was to remain flat, it actually causes less science research to be done because of the growing expense that we all face. So even flat would have been discouraging, but what we're facing now is something much more chaotic, uncertain, and not. It's hard to be hopeful in this time.
So I had a look at the budget numbers, federal funding for the institutions of higher education, and I saw that between 2004 to 2022, it increased incredibly by 53%. But listening to you, I have the suspicion that this was mainly an increase in student aid.
So I couldn't tell you about those specific numbers, but some of that might be eaten a bit by inflation. I'm not sure. But I can say over the last several years for the NIH, it's been flat. The NSF grew a little bit this last year before the current administration came in. But there are other branches of the R&D. Some of it could be the grants that Lee was just referring to. There's mechanisms to support the National Institutes of Health, the actual research in buildings within Bethesda, Maryland, and the researchers there. So I can't speak to those, but I can speak to the amount of money that has been distributed to these kind of research grants that I mentioned before. Those have been largely flat. Like the NIH's, I think in 2024 was approximately $48 billion for the entire U.S. And the NSF is much smaller. It's like $11 billion or so.
you also have agencies like Department of Defense and Department of Energy that I think Department of Energy probably has increased the most in terms of actual funding. But it's hard to say when you look at the overall number. It seems to be growing, but actually you have to look into the below that and see where the money is going to what accounts. And since some, as Michelle said, are flat, I would just thought maybe I add one other point that might be helpful for your listeners is that, or two quick points is one, that federal funding for grants is it's really for not only, but primarily is a main source of support for staff at Research One University. So when you come to research, you're hired at Research One University. What I mean by Research One is like the University of Michigan or Columbia University, University of Berkeley, or Wisconsin. When you're hired as a faculty member, they'll say, here's maybe X amount of money. And then after that, you exhausted, we expect you to basically fund your own position thereafter. And that's where federal funding becomes very important for research institutions. The other point is that, let's say you get a 8-year grant. It's not as if you get the money all at once. It's given to you, doled out every year. And so, as Michelle was pointing out, when you have programs, even people who have grants on a long-term basis, they have sort of financial uncertainty because they don't know that money's going to be guaranteed for this fiscal year or next fiscal year.
So this means that certain large research universities do not just depend on federal funding for PhD positions and like research staff, but actually for professors, for their actual faculty.
Yes, some of the budget goes to the salaries of the faculty, supporting the faculty.
Yeah,
the
that's
students.
an important point.
Staff.
So if you're hired by a university, you really have to fish for your own salary at some point from the federal pot. And so these cuts really put people into jeopardy that, normally when you're in a tenured position, you expect to be there until your retirement age, or in the United States, even beyond that. So hearing that there you can actually be reliant on federal funding is quite concerning. Now, the government is reasoning that a lot of this research money has been used towards certain political agendas, that in essence, federal funding of higher education has been politicized, is part of the argument. But listening to what the funding has usually been put forward to and what has been reliant on the funding, I have a hard time really buying that argument. So from your perspective as people who are part of that system, to what extent is the idea of politicized funding really a valid argument?
Well, my sense is probably less so in the sciences and then probably more so in the humanities, and social sciences probably fall somewhere in between. I think it is fair to say that, for the humanities and to some extent the social sciences, it is, I wouldn't say it's politicized, but the people they draw for the review process, they tend to be from, quite frankly, from one ideological camp. We know this in polls and studies that professors in America in the humanities are pretty overwhelmingly on the left, and also to some extent the social sciences. And so when you have such as a National Endowment for the Humanities grant or National Endowment Arts grant, that's going to be peer reviewed by people who sort of already buy into that ideology. I've sat on a couple National Endowment Review grants in DC, and there is a bit of a group thing, to put it quite frankly. I think that's probably less so in the sciences where, experiments sort of fall, they succeed or fail on their own terms in that way. The empirical evidence shows itself. But I think there's probably some legitimate criticism with regard to the humanities.
Michelle, the sciences have been freed from all accusations from Lee's side. What is your perspective?
In a pure form, scientists, we try to, test our hypotheses, see if data supports these hypotheses or not. That's how science is conducted in the purest of forms. And and yeah, it's done also by humans, right? So, while saying this, I don't quite understand how it could be. I've been surprised by the things that have become political that I thought were apolitical have become political. Even in the States, the topic of vaccination, something that I never would have imagined to be political, has now somehow become just that. Um, and to be clear, we all know that there is no science evidence to support that vaccines cause autism or any long-lasting diseases or disorders. And yet there's a message here in the United States that's saying something different. So I don't understand how anything like this has happened.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think especially with the sciences and mathematics, is that inherently these disciplines are not sort of have a political agenda, but I think it's the perception or the interpretation of people who have a political agenda that want to politicize science and mathematics in a way that sort of put faculty on the defensive. And I would make perhaps a larger point. This is really part of the Trump administration sort of a war against the Department of Education. This is something they've been trying. Conservatives and Republicans have always disliked the Department of Education, and now they see this as their opportunity to do so. And I think, unfortunately, one of the casualties of this is sort of science and mathematics.
So you think the fact that not only the humanities and social sciences have been targeted is just because there is this broader agenda of tearing the Department of Education down, or is there some other ideological reasoning afoot?
I would say it's primarily this broader attack on the Department of Education. We have to remember the Department of Education only came in creation, I think it's 78 or 79 or Jimmy Carter. And that was essentially basically a political gift for the teachers union support of his candidacy in 76 and for his re-election attempt in 1980. So, when the Republicans make a case that the functions that are done by the Department of Education can be done through other departments. That's true. Actually, the Department of Education has a very short lifespan compared to other federal agencies. So I think a lot of it is driven by ideology in this particular case.
But I mean, what is the end game here? They are putting excellent, world-renowned universities into jeopardy, or parts of their research agenda into jeopardy, for the sake of ending one department that you could just have phased out in another way.
Well, I think it's part of it. I think it's also part of it is that there's a great suspicion among conservatives and Republicans on American universities. There's a sense that whether it's true or not, there's at least a perception on the right that, if you send your children to the universities, they're going to be politically indoctrinated, especially in the humanities and social sciences. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but that's certainly the perception. And so I think this is going after the Department of Education is a way to go after the universities and really sort of compel universities to take a more politically neutral stance on how they teach students in the humanities and social sciences. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times this morning or yesterday that went through some of the universities who are trying to basically comply with the new federal regulations so they can preserve their funding and student aid and sort of and take a more sort of political neutral tone. I think what's happened is also we have to take in the context of light of October 7th, the attacks and sort of the rise of, quite frankly, anti-Semitism in some of our prominent campuses. This, of course, hurt universities' reputations and hurt their authority. So I think there's probably some legitimate reasons for the federal government to prevent that from happening and make sure that universities are in compliance in terms of civil rights for all students. But I think one of the unfortunate casualties of that well-intended effort is federal funding for science.
And I mean, you have been targeted at the end of the day as a Roman Catholic university as well that did not have any incidents of anti-Semitism. I remember your president writing in the Wall Street Journal that you're actually very welcoming of Jewish students and would create a safe space for them. So in a sense, everyone's been a victim in higher education unless they have foregone federal funds in the first place, such as you named it, the relatively conservative Hillsdale College in Michigan. So isn't this a total overshooting?
I think to some extent, it's. I mean, Hillsdale is sort of a unique spot because they don't accept federal funding, so they can be overtly political in their views and recruiting, and it's been a very successful model for them. But for all the other universities in the country, it's for better or worse, we've gone into this partnership with the federal government really since World War II, and in many ways it's been a benefit to the universities. But I think now we're starting to see. For universities, are starting to see some of the potential problems of that partnership, depending upon who's in control of the government. I do think, if to be fair to the Trump administration, I do think there are probably some cases of where the universities might have gone too far politically. Certainly, with the case of anti-Semitism. And there was a needed correction for this, but this might be an overcorrection.
And it's been astounding how even very wealthy institutions are very vulnerable to this kind of political change in agenda and withdrawal of federal funding. I was really surprised when I first read that Columbia and Harvard are so easily threatened. But now understanding how many positions, how many faculty spots, etc., are dependent on this starts to make a lot more sense. Where do American universities and colleges go from here? So you've said in the beginning, Michelle and Lee, that there is this great level of uncertainty. So what path ahead do you see for your own research and for your institution?
That's a great question. Michelle, do you want to go first or do you want me to take it?
So at this time, I think many scientists, including myself, like I'm still submitting grants. I'm still submitting papers to be productive. We are trying to move forward with our job. Like we enjoy doing what we do. We find it valuable and really important and worthy for a lot of reasons. And although, again, just to acknowledge this frustration when we submit grants, it's uncertain of when they will be reviewed or even if they will be reviewed. But yet we have to keep trying, right? If we don't submit these grants, if we don't be productive, if we don't move forward, then everything has come to a stop, which is at this time really hard for me to wrap my head around. It seems inconceivable at this point. So I keep trying, and like I mentioned before, my lack of confidence and how to consult my students, my current undergraduates who are considering, moving into the health sciences and in PhD programs in particular. We're trying to make plan Bs. We're trying to move forward cautiously and realistically, and being honest with them about what the administration is saying currently and what we do and do not yet know.
Yeah, I think just building off on that, I mean, short term, I think universities are being compliant to receive the federal aid they need to survive. The larger question is what happens long term? Is this a blip or is this a long-term trend? And if it's a long-term trend, then I think what you'll see is universities are going to pivot to look for funding more from nonprofit institutions like the Gates Foundation, so on. They'll look for community partnerships and corporate partnerships in the private sector. So I think there'll be probably a move away. If it's a long-term trend, there'll be a move away from federal reliance and to look more to the private sector and even to some extent state government. Though state government funding will never be able to really replace federal funding.
Where does that leave academic freedom? Does it just mean you have to change your tune if you want to get federal funding? Or do you still be able to do your research as freely and as open-minded as possible?
Well, I think it depends upon the disciplines. I think, quite frankly, humanities and to some extent the social sciences are probably more vulnerable to this than the natural sciences and mathematics. Um, and then, the reality is that when these regulations are imposed, and then they'll probably be challenged in court, and then they'll go through the court system to determine what is the parameters of academic freedom. But I think it really is sort of disciplinary specific in that way. I don't know if Michelle, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, one way it impacts science is more recently the scientific community has been trying to broaden the people who are doing the science. Traditionally, it's been very white dominant, very male white dominant, and so we've been trying to bring more people to the table, and people from diverse backgrounds. It just builds and beautifies, the community. And so, and many grants, both from the NIH and NSF, were targeted to do just that, to bring and enhance diversity and to help people from different backgrounds to be able to join the table, like I said. But those grants have been, many of them have been withdrawn. Many of them have disappeared on the website. Like you go to look for these certain grants, they no longer seem to exist on certain government websites. So that is a tragic loss, to not have support for training, like I said before, the next generation of scientists, but to also train, more diverse, to increase the number of viewpoints and the different backgrounds and to bring them together. And I've also been reading that many research grants have been canceled because they were trying to, analyze gender, for example, males versus females and how they might react to a certain drug, right? Physiologically, what might be different. And, things like this are getting caught in these odd filters that someone's putting in to try to eliminate DEI initiatives. So there's a lot of initiatives that are rolling out with huge ramifications that I maybe weren't intended, but are happening all the same.
Well, my sense is probably they're using AI and they're just doing a word check. And so even if something like any word of gender or race comes up, even if it's a scientific study, they'll just ask the funding, which is really sort of, it's a not effective way to do that.
Agreed. But that just kind of speaks to the point, right? The rashness, the hurriedness, the lack of thought or careful planning here has huge ramifications.
There seems to be a total disregard for all the collateral damage that comes with what they actually want to achieve.
Agree. Yeah, I think the other thing that we haven't talked about, but it's worth mentioning, is that just the sheer reduction of employees at the Department of Education, and so, as Michelle mentioned earlier, when you submit a grant, it takes a long time for it to be processed, and now it's going to even take longer. There's also, I think, a few days ago, they've let go 100 people from the National Center of Education Statistics, which keeps track of all the data of K through 12 in higher education. And so it's just going to be just difficult to even know, looking at the data in the future, if it's reliable. So these, there's probably a legitimate argument for the Department of Education and federal bureaucracies to be more efficient and to reduce the workforce, but doing it in a way that's sort of not planned out does have these unintended consequences.
So, in a nutshell, academic freedom in the United States, yes, but there will be restrictions in terms of less diversity, probably, and gathering from what Michelle said, and that there might be people in the humanities who have to tread more carefully in how they are framing their research. Is that a fair summary?
I think it varies from school to school. It's hard to say with a country as large as ours and with as many diverse institutions. I mean, you have some universities that have been very defiant and actually have leaned into more into academic freedom. Some humanities departments have been, have called to federal regulations, but others have been remained robust. So I think it's a real mixed bag. It's hard to make a generalization. Quite frankly, I think it's too early to tell. Probably a year from now, we will have a better sense of how things have shaken out. But at this point, it's sort of it's mixed.
It's mixed and too early to call. I think that's a good way to conclude. And I think the message is also that European researchers should still come to the United States and participate in conferences, because if we don't, well, where does that leave academic freedom?
I would agree. And I would tell your European colleagues, if they're worried about academic freedom, there's probably no safer place than an American academic conference.
We'll take that as an invitation. So for all those of you who are listening and who are interested to learn more about higher ed and our two guests' take on it, Lee has actually written 2 books or edited 2 books on the first one, Why the Humanities Matter Today, and the second one, The College Lecture Today. And no matter how things will develop in recent weeks, months, and years, I think they have enduring lessons for us all. Thank you so much, Lee and Michelle, for joining us from Worcester, Massachusetts, and all the best with your research and work.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us.
And thank you to all of those of you who have been listening. We look forward to having you back again among our listeners. And with that, I say auf Wiedersehen.
Grüezi Amerika. Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler.